There are a few songs in our songbook which I have to request not be sung before I'm to get up and speak, because when they do, I can't proceed. I found another one. Thank you so much, John. And thanks, Buzz, for the prayer that you've offered on our behalf this morning. We want to thank those who are visiting here. Several of our members are out, among them Jacob and Gavin, which is why I'm here, and I'm so thankful to the elders for the privilege and the opportunity to fill in for them this morning. The other thing that you need to know, as John briefly said, we have a tradition here, and that is to put aside the fifth Sunday of the month to focus our attention specifically, totally and completely on the Lord's Supper. And so another privilege that I have is to share with you an extended meditation upon some aspect of Jesus' death upon the cross. Now, a few weeks ago, we were engaged in a study of the book that is being taught in the auditorium class both Sunday morning and Wednesday night, the book entitled Christ Before Our Eyes. And this is a series of reflections and meditations intended to help us observe the Lord's Supper more meaningfully. And we were studying the chapter on Into Your Hands I Commit My Spirit. And I was privileged to be able to teach that night. The entire text is what Don read for us just a moment ago, Luke chapter 23 and verses 44 through 49. And we're going to be looking at a piece of that as we begin this morning. We talked about the supernatural darkness that fell upon the land. For the last 3 hours that Jesus was upon the tree, it appears as though there was just silence. And the time drug on. And Jesus was getting weaker by the moment. The impact of the scourging definitely had an effect upon how long Jesus survived upon the cross. With each moment, each breath, it required more agonizing effort. And then at the very end, there's a flurry of activity. It's like Jesus had this last burst of energy. He says, I thirst, seeming to call to mind Psalm 22, where David, who appears to be seeing in foreshadow the death of Jesus on the cross, he says his tongue is stuck to the top of his mouth. Well, Jesus says, I thirst, and they bring him some vinegar to drink. Jesus says, my God, why are you forsaking me? Again, calling to mind Psalm 22, which Jesus, in my mind, seems to be saying in order to remind or to bring to the attention of particularly the Jewish leaders who would have been very familiar with Psalm 22, that what David is talking about in that psalm is being played out before them. Jesus says, it is finished, indicating that the work of salvation that God had sent him to do was done. And then finally, with his last breath, with his last ounce of energy, he says, into your hands I commit my spirit. And we delve deeply into what might have been meant by Jesus when he said that. But then we ran out of time. The bell rang. We weren't done. But you know, it was Wednesday night. You know what happens when the bell rings on Wednesday night? Chaos ensues, right? So we had to be finished, even though we weren't finished. And so what I'd like to do with our time this morning is I'd like to finish looking at that passage. We're going to pick up the reading at verse 47, Luke chapter 23, verse 47, where it says, now when the centurion saw which had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. Now, looking first at the statement of the centurion, you might notice that there's a difference between what Luke records and what Matthew and Mark record. And Matthew and Mark's record is sort of imprinted in my mind because when I was very young, I watched the movie The Greatest Story Ever Told. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but you might remember at the end of it, you see the place of the cross. and the supernatural darkness that has descended. And you see Jesus hanging on the cross, just a silhouette. But then at the foot of the cross, there is another silhouette who is obviously dressed in Roman military garb. And you hear with the voice of John Wayne, I wish I could mimic him, but I can't. Truly, this was the Son of God. Now, what Luke records is a little bit different than that. He says, truly this was, or certainly this was an innocent man. So which was it? Did the centurion say, truly this was the Son of God? Or did he say, certainly this was an innocent man? And of course, at this point, the skeptic jumps up and says, well, Luke has it wrong. He's made a mistake. See, the Bible is full of errors. We can't believe a single word that the Bible teaches. That's what the skeptic says. Well, what did the centurion really say? If we had been alive back then, if we had been standing at the foot of Jesus' cross the way he was, what would we have heard the centurion say? He could have said both. He could have said, truly this man was the Son of God. Certainly this man was innocent. And I think that that's an entirely reasonable explanation. Now there is another possible explanation. And that is, because from what I understand, ancient biographers did this from time to time, that Luke might be paraphrasing what the centurion said in order to achieve a certain thematic goal. In other words, in order to set what the centurion says within the larger context of what's going on, he changes it a little bit. But think about it with me. If the centurion said, truly this man was the Son of God, wouldn't he have also been saying, in a sense, truly we have crucified an innocent man? And given the direction that Luke's narrative takes, I think there may be a thematic objective that Luke is trying to accomplish. Again, in verse 47, he says, now the centurion saw what had taken place. He praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. But then Luke goes on in verse 48 and says, and all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breast. What does that mean? What's the significance of the people who are walking away from Golgotha, having watched Jesus breathe his last? What's the significance of them beating their breast? Well, you know, in 21st century America, when we're watching football and the guy gets the touchdown and he jumps up, he beats his breast as sort of a show of victory, right? That's not what it meant in first century Judea. But instead, one would beat their breast as a demonstration of grief or regret or shame. There is another place in the New Testament where a reference is made to a person beating their breast. And this is recorded by Luke as well, in Luke chapter 18. Now this is the story of the self-righteous Pharisee and the penitent tax collector. And you might remember the self-righteous Pharisee. Luke records how he stood there by himself, right? He stood there with himself. And he speaks to God as if God ought to be thankful that he has him as a worshiper. That's the self-righteous Pharisee. But what does it say about the penitent tax collector? And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The beating of the breast was an expression of regret or shame, and it shows that the crowd that is now dispersing agreed with the centurion that they had just crucified an innocent man. You know, maybe it was seeing Jesus forgive those who were crucifying him. Maybe that's what caused them to think, wait a minute, is this really what we need to be doing? Maybe it was when they overheard the conversation that Jesus had with the thief on the cross, and he's talking about, this day you will be with me in paradise. Maybe that made them think, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Maybe it was the supernatural darkness that fell over the land. That's a sign that maybe they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. But then again, maybe it was the way Jesus took his last breath and committed his soul into the hands of God. Maybe it was all that and more. But on that day, when they went home, they realized that a huge injustice had been done. They had crucified an innocent man. And I wonder how many of those, we don't know. There's no way that we can know. But how many of those might have been present 50 days later on the day of Pentecost, when in Jerusalem there is the sound of a rushing mighty wind. There is the cloven tongues of fire that descend upon the apostles. Peter stands up and speaks and quotes Joel, saying, "This is what Joel prophesied about." And then with other references to other passages in the Old Testament, Peter convinces many in the crowd, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ." And at this word they were cut to the heart because they knew it to be true. The ground from which the realization had sprung forth was made fertile by what they had witnessed when they watched Jesus die. They knew they had crucified an innocent man, and they realized that that innocent man was now their Lord in Christ. The innocence of Jesus is an important component in what I might refer to as the constellation of factors that make the death of Jesus on the cross so significant for us. I mean, we get together and we observe the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. Men get up here and provide reflections, contemplations, meditations, whatever you want to call it, on the death of Jesus on the cross. And it's something different each and every week. The story of Jesus' crucifixion is so rich with significance. And his innocence is one of those things. Now remember that the crowd, the centurion and the crowd, were not the first ones to realize that Jesus was innocent. Remember that Judas, of course, Judas betrayed Jesus. Why did he betray Jesus? Was it only greed? We really don't know. But what we do know is that after betraying Jesus and after seeing what happened to Jesus, well, I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 27 and verses 3 and 4. It says there, "Then Judas, who betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, 'I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood.'" Judas knew Jesus to be innocent. He had spent every moment of the last 3 years with Jesus. He had heard his teaching. He had seen his love and compassion. Judas knew that Jesus had done nothing deserving of death. Of course, it wasn't just Judas. It was Pilate too. Remember Pilate, and from a strictly historical standpoint, Pilate is not known as a man who was particularly interested in justice. But when Jesus was brought before him, and when Pilate considered all of the facts, especially the trumped-up charges that the Jews had brought before him, he knew that Jesus was innocent. In fact, in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 24, he says, he washes his hands, remember that? He says, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person." He calls Jesus a just person. So we have Judas acknowledging the innocence of Jesus, Pilate acknowledging that Jesus was innocent. The centurion considers all of the things that have gone on over the last 6 hours, and he proclaims Jesus as innocent. And the onlookers who went home, heading home because the Sabbath is approaching, but as they walk, they beat their breast because they knew that Jesus was an innocent man. Now, I want to ponder for just a few moments the role that Jesus' innocence plays in our appreciation of the significance of the crucifixion. From the description of in the Old Testament of the Passover lamb, this is Exodus chapter 12 and verse 5. It says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish." Let's go ahead and stop there because that's the part that we need. Without blemish. The phrase without blemish comes from a Hebrew word, tamim, meaning a perfect representation of the species. And with respect to a lamb that was selected for the Passover, it was to be a perfect representation in physical development, whatever, of the species. And you know, it's amazing. As you read the Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those laws that have to do with the sacrifices that were done under the old law, almost without exception, I wasn't able to look at all of them because there's a whole lot of them, but almost without exception, it requires that the sacrifice be without blemish, a perfect representation of the species. As we learn in Leviticus chapter 17 and verse 11, it was the life that in the blood that made atonement for sin. But the sacrifice that was offered had to be perfect as well. Now, as we know, lambs, bulls, goats, they're not moral creatures. And so it could not truly be said that they are innocent. But I think the fact that they were required to be without blemish suggests that an idea there. And it seems to me that their physical perfection was indeed intended to foreshadow the moral perfection that the ultimate sacrifice that would eventually be offered for all the world would have. And I think this is why Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 18, he says, with the precious blood of Christ as a lamb without blemish and without spot. In the book of Hebrews, the author contrasts the animal sacrifices under the old law with the one sacrifice that was offered by the one who was the fulfillment of all of the foreshadows. Speaking of Jesus in Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 26, he says, for such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens. Not only does the innocence complete the foreshadows of the Old Testament, but it teaches us a very important message about the nature of sin and the problem of sin that it brings upon the world. Turn over to Romans chapter 8 and verse 3. We've been running through several passages relatively quickly, but I want to rest for a moment on this one. Romans chapter 8 and verse 3. This is where the Apostle Paul says, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. On account of sin, He condemned sin in the flesh. For a long time, I really struggled with what Paul meant with that phrase, He condemned sin in the flesh. What does Paul mean by that? Well, if you look back into chapter 7, Paul is writing about how sin took advantage of the law. For example, Romans chapter 7, verse 13, but that sin might appear sin was producing death in me through what was good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. See, the things that the law commanded were good and wholesome and necessary and effective for us, for the Jews living under it. But sin took an advantage of an inherent weakness in the law. It did not give the observers the power to overcome sin in their lives. Well, we come over to chapter 8, and Paul reveals in Jesus how we are given that power to overcome sin. Again, in verse 3 of Romans chapter 8, he says, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by the sending of His Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. On account of sin, He condemned sin in the flesh. So how does that work? How does Jesus condemn sin in the flesh? Let me suggest that His innocence played a really big role in that. He demonstrated, as chapter 7 says, the exceeding sinfulness of sin by letting sin do its worst to Him. And yet, He overcame sin. Of course, we see this most clearly in the temptation in the wilderness, right? Matthew chapter 4, Luke chapter 4, where he's led out by the Spirit out into the wilderness in a manner that seems to be related to the types of sins, the types of temptations to sin that are common to all of us. Jesus is tempted by Satan, and yet he overcomes. He wins the battle. But of course, the battle is not over at that point, right? Luke records in verse 13 of chapter 4, "Now when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time." Satan came back. There are other times that Jesus was tempted by him. And when we survey the life of Jesus, we see many instances where sin did its best to try to get to Jesus, and yet it failed. Think about how many times the Son of God suffered humiliation at the time from his brethren. They questioned his power. They attributed it to demons. They questioned his motives, accusing him that he was leading the people astray. And on many occasions, they tried to trap him in some inconsistency. Of course, their trap was laid based upon a misunderstanding of the old law, and Jesus saw right through it. But of course, all the power of sin to offer temptation to Jesus was unleashed in the crucifixion. 3 times he prayed, "Father, let this cup pass." But then he follows it up, "Not my will, but as you will." When he was arrested, he could have called 10,000 angels, but he didn't. And in what must have been history's clearest example of a travesty of justice, Jesus stood falsely accused before the Jewish and the Roman courts. Before the Jewish court, at first, no one would bring a charge against him. There was nothing. No one could think of anything. But then they find 2 false witnesses. Clear violation of the 10 Commandments, right? But they find 2 false witnesses who come forth, and they render the charge of blasphemy against him. Well, of course, the Romans are not going to care about blasphemy. So if they're going to accomplish their objective of putting Jesus to death, they're going to have to turn Jesus over to the Romans with some other charge besides blasphemy. So they trump up the charge of treason. They were not successful of convincing Pilate of that, but it was because of political expediency that Pilate turned Jesus over to be crucified. And so then a cascade of ultimate indignities began. The scourging that Buzz mentioned in the prayer. In fact, he went through this. The mocking, the blasphemy, but of course also the excruciating pain. And when darkness descended upon Judea that day, sin had done its worst. Sin had pulled out all stops trying to overcome Jesus. And for a time, it almost appeared that it had won. But then the third day, Jesus arose victorious over sin. And Jesus had, once and for all, decisively condemned sin in the flesh. Well, these are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you to prepare our minds to partake of the Lord's Supper. So at this time, we'll ask the men who are waiting on the table to come forward, and we will proceed. I'm not done talking about the innocence of Jesus, but what I'd like to do as we begin to close our time together is to make it personal. What does the innocence of Jesus in his crucifixion mean to us? Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but being made alive in the Spirit. It is that phrase, the just for the unjust, that I want to focus your attention on for just a few minutes. The justice, the righteousness, the innocence of Jesus. These things shine as a brilliant example that highlights our own injustice, our unrighteousness, and our guilt. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus comes into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. And I wonder about that passage. Is Paul really saying that as a matter of fact, he was the chief of sinners? As if, if someone were keeping an account and listing all of the sins that every person had ever committed, would Paul's list be longer than anybody else's? Or would the things that are on that list be worse than anybody else's? I mean, come on, history has also provided Hitler to us as well. No, I really think what Paul means by that is when he sees the innocence of Jesus and he contrasts that with the knowledge that he has of his own sin, that it sort of puts blinders on him. And it really doesn't matter what anybody else in the history of the world has done. As far as he is concerned, he might as well be the chief of sinners. What I think Paul is saying here is based upon considering Jesus' innocence in contrast with his own guilt. Here's the way I like to think about this. Our appreciation of the grace that we have received from God correlates with the magnitude of the difference between our perception of Jesus' innocence and our perception of our own guilt. When we have the idea that, I'm not such a bad guy. I mean, I compare myself to my neighbors and really, I'm doing pretty well, God ought to be thankful to have me as, somebody that worships Him. When that's our attitude, or when our knowledge of the person and the sacrifice of Jesus is just sort of like, I know, I've heard that there's this book, I think it's called the Bible, and it's about some guy that dies upon a cross. That doesn't really give us much of an appreciation of the grace that has been given to us by God. And so it really is the magnitude of the distinction between Jesus' innocence and our own guilt. That when we see things in this manner, then we realize how the just died for the unjust. When we see the innocence of Jesus, and like Paul, when we put those blinders on and we're just looking at ourselves, and that's all that really matters as we're doing this assessment, then we realize, as far as I'm concerned, nobody else matters. I'm the chief of sinners. That becomes a foundation upon which we can build a life of service to Jesus in appreciation for the grace that God has bestowed upon us through Him. And so Jesus' innocence is an important aspect of His life and His death, but we owe it to ourselves to meditate upon it and to come to that truly full appreciation of it in regard to how we have lived our lives and the grace that we have received. So I think this would be an appropriate time for us to sing an invitation song, because it may be that we have someone here this morning who has never really measured their life in comparison to the innocence of Jesus. You may see that there is some need that you have of a change. This is an opportunity to make a decision, to make a change, to, if you haven't already, to put Christ on in baptism. Whatever your need might be, the Christians stand ready, willing, and able to help you in any way that we can. Come forward as together we stand and sing.